time in your busy day ahead, we will get started. So,
Okay.
good afternoon, everyone. Morning for our guest speaker today, Matt Baida, who's based in Gothenburg, Sweden. But before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm here on Gadigal country here in inner west of Sydney, and of course the Bejigal people are the traditional custodians on the campus over at Kensington, and like to acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for their contributions and knowledge sharing of this incredible landscape here of the Sydney Harbour. I extend that welcome and acknowledgement to First Nations people joining us in the room today, and of course acknowledge the Sami people of the wonderful nation of Sweden in Northern Europe, where our guest speaker is joining us today, Matt Baida. Thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here talking to the third year undergraduate Bachelor of Landscape Architecture students in our course Landscape Performance for students. If you haven't already Googled and stalked Matt online and on his LinkedIn profile, and maybe you've had a couple of new additions there, Matt. Matt is a landscape architect, a previous recipient of the highly regarded Churchill Fellowship, and as a landscape architect, unique in this way. There's not many, Matt, who specialises in post-mining landscapes, particularly the social and environmental outcomes of these post-mined landscapes. You are a geomorphic, what did I write here? A rock designer, geomorphic landform designer.
Yeah, that's the
Which
one.
is fantastic. I think we should add that to the scope of the profession. And
Yeah,
we're really
definitely.
grateful for you giving up your morning from Gothenburg in Sweden to join us today and present the 6Rs, the WTF ramblings from Sweden. So Matt, I'm handing it over to you.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that introduction. Very nice. Actually, in Stockholm, Sweden, so a little bit further north, but it's a small country, so they're not too far apart. So yes, let's get into this, I guess. An interesting topic, and one that I've been thinking about the 6Rs for quite some time. So I've been looking to write something for our website, discussing these and defining what it is we actually mean when we talk about some of them, because in my head they've been sort of floating around with sort of an overlap of definitions, some undefined, some just what I want them to be. So it's been a useful exercise to actually sit down and have the time to think about them. I sat down with my business partner when Sara first asked to do the lecture, and I was like, asked if she could name the 6Rs. She's Swedish, so there's a translation difference there. I think she got through 4 of them, and we had a bit of a laugh as we tried to define them off the top of our heads and what they meant. And there's obviously a bit of an overlap in some of the R's in the way we use them. So essentially, the following lecture is just going to be my evolution through the R's. I put ramblings from Sweden. I don't know if I've never spoken about these before, so is it going to make sense? It's going to be useful for you guys. Time will tell. I'm sure hopefully you can take something from them anyway.
International mindset, Matt. We're all up for it.
Okay, awesome. And as I said, these are defined from my biases, I guess, from my sort of view of the world. So I'm open to be challenged, have my thinking changed, and open for debate on some of these. So today's mission, just loosely, is defining the 6Rs from an industry context. And as I mentioned, a bit of a clause in all of this is just one bloke's opinion from little old Sweden. So it's a big industry out there. This is just my views. So to sort of keep me on track a little bit, I'll talk about my journey into the profession, my introduction into some of their R's. I'll introduce everyone to geomorphic design. I think that's a really interesting topic that I'm working in, and also that flows on to my development and evolution of the R's for myself in the sort of industry perspective, which is where we'll finish. So I'll keep moving. I'm not sure how long this is going to be. Hopefully I don't ramble on too much. But if you let me indulge myself, I will just discuss my journey as a landscape architect a little bit into the mining world. So it all started at Adelaide University, born and bred Adelaide, and finished my design studies course there. Looking to be a landscape architect, but I think I spent more time in the university bar than I did on my design studies and my design theory, which I wasn't a big fan of. So it was off overseas. I went for a couple of years. I think maybe a couple too many in the end, but I enjoyed myself. So then it was back to Adelaide after that. No intention of going back to university, but I got myself a job as a field technician in the exploration industry. So essentially, we go out to the middle of nowheres all over Australia to these beautiful sort of culturally rich and environmentally rich landscapes, and we were doing geomagnetic surveying. Essentially, we're looking for ore bodies in the ground, which is the first step of mining. So if we found something, the surveys looked positive, the drillers would come in, they would take some core samples, they would go back to the geologist, and the process would continue to potentially the development of a mine site. So I got to visit my first mine site, the Challenger Gold Mine in Outback, SA. It's an underground mine, but still it's a bit of an impact on the landscape. And that's sort of when I started thinking, well, it's, out of sight, out of mind for us city folk. We're responsible for these scars on the landscape, but yet I couldn't stand apart from what I was causing out there. My phone, my computer, my cars, my appliances, the modern lifestyle that I wanted to live and be part of and was part of, created these impacts on the landscape. So, I got sort of pointed out to me quite quickly. It was a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? You can't have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. I couldn't not want these mine sites to happen on these landscapes where I was doing this exploration work, the mine sites to start up, but then want my modern lifestyle at the same time. So yeah, plenty of downtime out there, just working in the middle of nowhere, no coverage. I sort of decided that I wanted to impact the mining industry from a positive perspective. It was either that or go and become a hippie up a tree somewhere, which is quite appealing as well. But I chose the former option, and I headed back to university where I finished my landscape architecture degree. So I jumped into the master's course at Adelaide Uni to finish off the 2 years, and it was here that I met a lecturer, I forget her name, to be honest, I'm sorry about that, but she was a German lecturer, and she sort of opened my perspective on these post-industrial landscapes and some of the great projects that were occurring across Europe at the time. So it really got my thinking to, man, this is what I want to be doing. And I started my final project looking at a little mine site out of Adelaide, a mine site called Cadman 2. And my contact there was I think she was the environmental officer. So her perception of what I was going to do was do some garden beds and some garden paths around their little offices on sites. And in my head, I had, rock climbing the open pit, lake in community areas, a sculptural park and some sort of cultural history and mining history, where the tailings magazine used to be, the tailings facility, which is waste material that they cover over at the end of the mining process. So it's a far cry from what she had considered, talking about different revenue streams for the community post-mining and how that could be achieved. So I realized at that point there was a bit of an uphill battle for landscape architects in the mining world, but a fun challenge nonetheless. So with all of that said, I managed to land a job at Wax Design. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that company, a small company in Adelaide, but doing some great work. Fantastic company to work for, mainly doing play spaces and sort of urban design framework when I was with them. So I learned a hell of a lot, but it was never really my cup of tea. But I did manage, as Sara pointed out during the introduction, I managed to get myself a Churchill Fellowship, which I can highly recommend people look into. It's a chance to go and explore your passion a little bit and what interests you. Mine was looking at how landscape architects fit into the mining sector, and the idea of, I termed it social remediation at the time, how we could look more from a community perspective at these post-mining landscapes as was being done across Europe a little bit. So that sort of led me to be able to travel across the world and go and speak to people in the mining sector, landscape architects, and just discuss with them about what they're doing. So it was really beneficial. I headed to South Africa, the United Kingdom, the US, and Germany. So this is a site from Germany. It's an old open mine lignite coal mine in eastern Germany. So they're pretty amazing sites, huge scars on the landscape, but obviously from a cultural perspective, we're needed to sort of fuel the industrial revolution. You can see these big machines in the background. I think it's called an F60. You stand it upright, it's bigger than the Eiffel Tower, and it just destroys the landscape, pulling up the coal that's underneath the surface. So quite impressive machines. So then the fellowship led me to going to visit some of these sites that I've been studying at university and looking at in books and on the internet. So these were some of the projects. You can see this middle left image is the region where these coal mines were, and this is all these lakes were these old open pit mines that we saw in the previous image. So I'm not sure how many there were, but they were, as part of an EU funded project, I'm talking billions of dollars, they refilled the lakes and they interconnected all the lakes again. And the idea was to create a lake landscape for Germany and start to bring tourism back in an area that was financially, socially, and environmentally heading towards collapse. So it was an important project for the region. They got the community involved. You can see in the top right here, this guy in the background, architect, artist, he used to take people on tours down into the open pits to change their perception of what they saw. It wasn't this dirty, dusty landscape, but it was actually quite beautiful, and what it would become could be quite amazing as well. So the idea was reinstilling hope in these people. So you can see some of the projects. There's boat harbours. They've got one of these big F60 machines where they have concerts and events. The cultural mining heritage was important to maintain. This was a Charles Jenks design. I don't think it was built when I was there. It wasn't built when I was there. I'm not sure if it's built now, but fantastic. Another one, I got to visit a coal mine in Northumberland, the UK. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but the Lady of the North, Northumberlandia, Charles Jenks. Again, what these sites can become. At the time, there wasn't a visitor centre. I think there's now a visitor centre at this site. So, you know, the idea of what can these sites do for the community post-mining. We had a conference, a mine closure conference during the time at the Eden project. It was based in Cornwall, the UK, so really significant mining industry for the world. This was a copper mining area in Cornwall, really important for the Industrial Revolution throughout the UK, but left in despair again as the collapse of the industry occurred. So for a couple of decades, there wasn't much going on in this region. This was like a flagstone project where they looked at, I think they called it a educational charity that wanted to connect and build that relationship between people and nature again. So an amazing project. What it does for tourism for the region is incredible these days. I think it brings in over 1 million people a year to Cornwall. It was an old China clay pit they used for ceramics and paper. So really amazing projects, and so getting to visit these was just a really eye-opening experience to what could happen, and meeting the people involved in them to understand how some of these things eventuated was really what's led me to where I am today, is those key contacts that I've made. So this sort of led to my introduction of the R's. My final year project, of course, a little bit of the discussion around in landscape architecture at the time was some of the R's, and the fellowship is where I started to really define my interpretation or my definitions of these words. So what are some of those influences? I guess the first one, and probably one of the main ones, was a guy, Alan Berger, a landscape architect, a professor from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US. Some of his writings, some of his learnings and books were really key in my sort of development of my thinking. And he was very much a reclamation guy, talking about the social aspects of what these sites can become, and that they're not governed to what they used to be, but yet they can become something else, and that the mining process is just part of their history. So I sort of like that thinking around these old mine sites. Another one considered to be a bit of a pioneer also for landscape architects in the mining profession is a landscape architect from Boston, Julie Bargman. She runs a studio called Dirt, D-I-R-T, Dirt Studio, and one of her projects which I loved was this AMD and art park. So AMD is acid mine drainage. Again, quite often these communities have sort of hit a financial social collapse. The coal mining industry is closed, coal mining in this case as well. sort of left the area in a bit of despair. So some funding from the US government, they got a bit of a super fund for these sites, got a bunch of, I think there was a historian, landscape architects, a couple of hydrology groups, some government agencies come together to see what they could produce for this site. So they called it a reclamation project, if we're talking about the R's, and within that they had some remediation of water going on. So it wasn't just about cleaning up the acid mine drainage, which you can see in the top right here, which then can cause a huge impact on local waterways, the environment, the local animals, very acidic waste product. So it wasn't just cleaning that up, but it was also about instilling hope back in the community, which a lot of these projects are about. So they designed this series of remediation ponds where they could actually see the different metals dropping out of the water in each step of the pond. So it really was a visually prominent to the community what they were actually seeing to, again, reinstill that hope to them. So there's a few links to all of these as well. Hopefully you might be able to get the PDF and you can have a look a bit closer to all of these. So again, she was talking reclamation, which is something that started to sink into my brain. I also got to visit this guy called Neil McEnroy. He's a Scottish guy. So I went up to Manchester and Newcastle. And he was working for the Centre of Local Economic Strategies at the time, a really, really smart thinker about community resilience, local economies, community wealth building, they called it, and really how these communities can bounce back. 2008 was devastating on some of these communities, the global financial crisis, and he saw that the systems that they have just weren't adequate for what today's lifestyle looks like or today's systems look like. So they really started to develop the thinking around resilience in communities. It wasn't just a buzzword for them, but they were developing a model around this and actually testing with communities what resilience means in terms of their economic structures. So it's really fascinating. A lot of it was a bit over my head, to be honest, a really smart guy. But I loved his sort of, resilience is the buoying factor, how these communities can bounce back. And he was embracing the norm of change, which I think was really nice to think about from an economic structure, especially with mining communities that go through this boom and bust characterization where they're going well, everyone's moving in, and then next month or 2 years later when the commodity prices drop, everyone's fleeing the town. So really interesting that they think a little bit differently about their economies. This sort of occurred in Manchester and Newcastle back in the day, where coal mining and I think textiles for Manchester, their industries had collapsed. So I was there to learn a little bit about how they were developing these new economies and how that could be applied to the mine sites. So essentially, I had in my head that resilience was sort of based on sort of community and economics, and then reclamation was the idea that I use social remediation, but sort of I rolled that into reclamation as it had a bit of the environment and had the social context around it as well. So this could sort of come out a little bit in my thinking as I started to write my fellowship report, which you got a link to as well if anyone wants to have a bit of bedtime reading. I won't go through all of the text. Sorry for adding so much text to a slide as well, but I went back to have a look when I was looking at over the weekend, where did my R's come from? Where did my thinking come from, and how did it develop? And you can start to see, challenge the traditional thinking around rehabilitation, that move beyond the idea that the landscape should be restored. So I sort of moved on from rehabilitation and restoration a little bit, thinking they were a bit maybe more from the ecological side. I'm coming at it from the social. They were maybe a bit of the older mentality around it. We got these landscape architects that are putting a bit of theory and thinking to it. So, the question facing landscape architects, I said, was to reclaim or to restore. Reclamation, I like the concept of you can't turn the ecological clock back. You're not trying to recreate what was there before. It was some form of productive use, whereas rehabilitation, I know the definition that you guys use, I believe, isn't about trying to recreate what was there previously, but in my head in the time, that's what that was about. It's not possible to really re-establish what took thousands and thousands of years to develop in the ecosystem. And then we come and destroy it in a matter of years. You change the sort of geochemical properties, the material of the waste rock goes from compacted to non-compacted. You've got these chemicals leaching out. So how do you possibly go about trying to recreate what was there? You've changed the sort of soul of that landscape and you're trying to recreate what was there. So in my head, you could only really fail at doing this. So I was definitely a reclamation person, and I'd sort of put probably rehabilitation and restoration to the side a little bit in my thinking. Not saying it wasn't valuable, but I just used the term reclamation. Hadn't really thought about regeneration so much, or what's the other R that'll come to me? But resilience I then associated with community, I guess, and sort of economic structure. So that's a little bit of where my R's come from, and my influences for them. So just moving on to how they've sort of developed since then through my experience in the mining industry, as I've sort of slowly but surely got myself into working in the thick of the mining industry. And I guess that's where this next section is going to go to a little bit from here. So I was invited back to Sweden post fellowship with some of the contacts that I met to talk to a few mining industries here, and I managed to get myself a job here in those couple of years. I moved here in 2016 to Stockholm with a company that was doing schoolyards again. So nothing too exciting from my perspective, but yet they gave me the mission of trying to use my contacts to get some work in the mining industry. So it's a bit difficult to start with, not having really any relationships here, and just put myself out there and made a few things happen and managed to land one project in particular, which really put me in the thick of things and developing my knowledge within the mining industry, and got me to where I wanted to be, and that was impacting, I think, positively the mining industry. So in 2017, I think it was this guy in the background pointing, a university professor, microbiologist, who said, I don't know where he got my name from, but he somehow emailed me or called me and said, can you design a waste rock deposit? For those that don't know, a waste rock is in the background here. We'll see some better images of them soon. Is a byproduct of the mining process. So they take the ore out, they process the ore, and then they get the valuable part of the mining industry, which then they go and sell as metals, and that's what we use in our phones. That can be copper, iron, whatever, but then there's a waste material that comes from that. One of them is called just waste rock, we call it, which then gets piled up in the landscape in these big structures. So he's called me. I've never had anything really to do with them at this point, never designed them, hadn't really considered how you would. And he said, can you design a waste rock deposit, 100 million tons, and then we need the water from that deposit to be directed to these bioreactors. So these bioreactors were these subsurface holes in the ground with wood chip, and on those wood chips develop nitrate fixing bacteria. And so the issue was the leachate from these waste rock deposits was high in nitrogen, which would then impact the surrounding landscape higher than what there was allowed from the authorities. So the idea was that these the leachate water from the waste rock deposit would move through the bioreactor, and then that would clean the water. So we'd get clean water, would remove the nitrogen from the water. So this is where it all began. So sorry to get a bit deep into that, not so important, the process of that, but that's where it began. So for a year and a half, I considered, shit, what have I done? Like, this is 100 million tons. I don't even know what to do. I don't have any software to do this. And I was reading a research paper from a colleague, Canadian landscape architect I met on the fellowship again, and she is writing a research paper on geomorphic design. And that was a light bulb moment. I said, this is it. This is brilliant. This is what I need to be doing. And I gave her a call and she tipped me on a course in Madrid that was coming up. So I headed over there and managed to get in the landform design course, it was called, and there was the best lecturers and experienced experts in the world teaching about geomorphic design. So one thing led to another. I started to learn about geomorphic design. So what is geomorphic design? I mean, essentially, the concept is looking at a natural, stable landform in the same climate that you're in, and then you design and build that. So what is a stable natural landform and what characterizes that? When we look at this, really basically, a couple of the key characterizations of what a stable landform is. A stable landform is one that's not eroding. So there's no new erosion occurring. It's got to a point that we call a mature landform or a reached hydrological stability. So a couple of those key components of these ridges, they go from convex to concave, convex to concave. So that's the erosion has created that slope profile. So that's on the down slope. It's also on the cross slope as well. It creates these watershed areas. So within, this is one watershed up the top. You can imagine there's a slope going into this valley here as well, and a slope on this side that you can see. So all the water within that area is taken care of within that watershed, and there's no new erosion occurring. Same here, there's another watershed here. All this water that falls in here from rainfall is going to be directed down to another valley. So that slope profile is one of the key characteristics of a stable landform. Another one is the formation of these, the ridges and the swales. So that creates a surface drainage network. So water will fall on the ridge, it will be directed to the swale. From the swale, it gets directed to the valley. So you can see here, water falls on the ridge, it gets directed to the swale. It then gets directed to the valley. It leaves the site without any erosion occurring. So northern Sweden was 10,000 years ago under an ice sheet, up to 1 kilometre thick. So this landscape has taken 10,000 plus years to form from these wind and erosion processes. So we take inputs, we go out and measure some of these inputs, and then we put them into our modeling work. So essentially geomorphic design is just compressing time, and we're designing what Mother Nature does, but we do it today without needing to wait 10,000 years. You can see here a geomorphic design. You've got ridges, you've got swales, you've got the main valley channel. So these are the same elements that we see in the natural landform that have been designed in a CAD-based software to create this watershed area as part of this geomorphic design process. So again, water's going to fall, it's going to be directed to the swale, it's going to be directed to the valley. So you can see the components of the natural landscape in this design landscape. So why do we do geomorphic design? As I mentioned, these old waste rock deposits on the left here, what we call conventional approach to waste rock depositing is based on jamming as much volume in the smallest footprint as possible for the least amount of cost as possible, essentially is the way it's been gone. They build it in these lifts, these big pyramid-like structures. So normally a 20-meter lift here in Sweden, a 10-meter bench, a 20-meter lift, a 10-meter bench. Over time, these landscapes want to erode. Every landform wants to erode back to sea level. That's what these erosive forces are doing. And you can see this bottom image. So we've got this sort of pyramid-like geometric shape. The erosive forces are going to want to erode that over time. We're talking 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. Mother Nature's going to work on this. So we're sort of fighting what nature's wanting to do. And these landscapes today, they also, it's not just about fitting the volume like it used to be as a waste product, but now we're talking about there needs to be some sort of post-mining land use. The community can reuse these landscapes somehow. We want a rich ecology with a rich biodiversity. They're meant to blend in with the surrounding landscape. So I think you can already see that these have a very tough time of making those goals achievable. So when we look at a geomorphic design as an alternative, we're already using nature as a template, creating these natural landforms that doesn't fight against water, but uses nature to then deal with water just as nature does. it creates this complex surface which has different ecological niches. So there's different aspects, there's different gradients, there's different areas of moisture retention. Whereas these are just these big single gradient slopes that can be kilometers long. That's not great for plant diversity or animals to climb back over these, especially if erosion's occurring. So these have a lot of benefit for geomorphic design, and from that point, it's been a bit of it was a bit of an easy sell to come back to the mining companies here in Sweden, quite progressive in their thinking, and start selling the idea of geomorphic design. And really, for me, for the first time since I've become a landscape architect, I felt like I knew what I wanted to do. It is a broad profession, and it's taken me a little while to find out where exactly I fit. But as I mentioned, wanting to impact the mining industry positively is where I've found myself, and quite enjoying what I'm doing. So it's an educational process. No one knew about geomorphic design in Sweden, so every meeting, every presentation's been about educating the mining industry here, educating myself. 2 years ago, I didn't know what geomorphic design was. So it's been a bit of a fun process, a challenging process, but we're here today, which has led me to starting my company, Vast. So I've got a business partner here, Frida. She's a Swedish lady who we worked with at Cedarville together. So some of our thinking was early on, we were influenced by a book, I don't know if anyone's read it, called The Good Ancestor, and the idea that the actions we have today, it's not us who suffers most from them, but our children and their children, and that we don't have a planet B. So we weren't interested in short-termism, which the mining industry can be sometimes. So our ambition was simply to provide something beneficial to humankind and leave a positive legacy. So it's been a really, really great process so far. The project that I was talking about then developed into a bigger project with this company, and hence we got the ability to start the company. So this is the mine site, and you'll see it in real life in a second in an image, just to orientate people a little bit. So this was a hilltop here, and back 100 plus years ago, they started mining the top of the hilltop for iron, and they started developing this open pit area. So you can see the wall where they've dug away the hillside. The deposit now goes underground. So they're chasing the ore deposit underground, which you can't see anymore, but they've got 460 kilometers of underground tunnels. They are mining at a depth of 1.3 kilometers underground. The township over here, half of it's being moved because they've got an issue where they're mining underground. The landscape on top of it is sinking. So they're actually moving half the community to a new location, which has been a massive sort of urban design project in itself. And we had to develop a geomorphic design for this site. So the project I introduced to start with was just looking at a little design for this part of the site. But we then continued our discussions with the mining company. We've done a geomorphic design for a bigger portion of the site, including what we call the deformation zone, which is under this area. I'll show you in a second, where that landscape is sinking due to the underground mining. So this is our geomorphic design. It's called what we call a phase one conceptual design. So in theory, this is a non-erosive landscape that has a lot more benefits for reintroducing biodiversity or increasing biodiversity. As Sara mentioned up front, here is the First Nations people, the Sami. They got their reindeer herding industry. So a big issue for them is the fragmentation of the landscape occurring from mining, road infrastructure, forestry. So they don't like the mining industry too much. So this gives an opportunity to actually give something back to them, a reusable bit of land that they can benefit from again, hopefully. So the scale of this, 760 hectares, 424 million tons. I can't still comprehend what that is, 424 million tons. Those big trucks, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the big mining trucks where the tires are twice as big as people. Their payload is 220 tons. So if they use those trucks to deposit all of this material, you'd need 200 trips with one of those trucks. 2 million trips to deposit that amount. So you're working your model, you're working it a little bit, trying to get the landscape to function, the water to run how it should, not too steep. And then you zoom out and get to site and you realize, Jesus Christ, where have I got myself here? It's pretty serious business, but all good fun. So this is what the landscape looks like. So this is the open pit that we saw when mining started back in the day. The open pit continues here, and then they start going underground, and you can see a little bit, shows it okay. This landscape, you can see the terraces of this landscape. So that's not natural, that's the ground sinking due to the underground mining operation. So we developed a visualization for this site just to show what their future vision could be. So they had some ideas about wanting to reintroduce it to the Sami, letting the groundwater create what we call a pit lake as well, and our geomorphic design covering the deformation zone. So that was their vision, and this was the visualization that we developed for them to use and promote to the community. So you can see the water's refilled the lake and the geomorphic design over here. So pretty amazing how that's developed, and hopefully that will continue. Excitingly, we have developed Scandinavia's first test site, which has just been built. So this is the design for it. So just to quickly run you through that. Again, the end from the beginning is an important concept. You can see the design has already built into it the drainage system, the swales, the ridges, and the valley, the channel bottom, which directs water with no additional erosion. And then how that looks with a geomorphic test site is, again, you can see the ridges directing water to the swale directing water to the channel, and then that connects, in this case, to another drainage channel. So this is a 4-hectare site at another one of that same company's mine sites. So you can see all we're doing is compressing time. We're taking what Mother Nature does, fast forward the process by design, and then build that outcome. So this is a great example. You can see the traditional 20-meter left, a bench, a 20-meter lift, a bench. So that's what they do to store their waste rock at the moment. And we're saying, well, why not do something like this? Because it's got all these additional benefits. So this is 1 million tons of waste rock. You can sort of, for scale, there's a person and there's a dual cab ute. So you can see that this is a massive landscape, 4 hectares, 100 million tons. You times that by 424. So we're talking some big landscapes that hopefully we can return to some sort of use for the Sami and the local populations. Just quickly to finish off on that, to give you a bit of an idea of how it looks at a bigger scale. They were quite a small test site. This is a job, we weren't involved in this. This was before our time as geomorphic designers, but this is in New Mexico in the US. This was a coal mine, and you can see the geomorphic area roughly from Google Earth, but it really shows how well it blends in, creating that natural topography as well. So zoom in a little bit closer and you can see some of the geomorphic design. If you're going to be critical, it does have a fishbone pattern, which we're trying to work to alleviate that a little bit, but still from bird's eye view, you pick this up. Every design is different, so everyone designs this a little bit different. It can be achieved a little bit better. But really, the focus here is this drainage channel coming through, connecting with the surrounding topography. So part of the geomorphic approach is really blending in with the surrounding terrain as well. And not the traditional way is just capturing everything on site and having your water managed on site. But here we're actually connecting back into these natural water systems. You see this river coming down the site here. So the design picks up all the water within this area and directs it back to this channel. So you're reconnecting the natural hydrology, surface drainage of the site. Maybe it looks a little bit washboardy from the top, but you look at this is a massive, you can see the scale, it's a massive landscape. I think this was 700 hectares. This was just the top dressing, the topsoil on it after the construction had finished. This was a couple of years later as the vegetation had started to establish. So they are big landscapes that we're dealing with, and so I guess the point of this was just to introduce that a little bit, and also the continued evolution of the R's, because we are heavily involved in a few of the R's with what we do. So then thinking about from an industry perspective now, how those R's are used. And as I mentioned, this is my opinion as a landscape architect. So happy to be challenged, happy to debate, also just happy to offer some of my ramblings, see what you think is useful or not. So it's been an interesting process getting into the mining industry and using some of these terms and concepts, because there's so many different players within the mining industry. Everyone works in their silos, and ecologists use resilience, landscape architects may use reclamation. So it's how those words are blended together and who actually understands what we're actually using. And I think, to be honest, people just use the word that they use. I mean, and they go with it. For example, if I use reclamation, I'm not having a client turn around and say, well, do you mean rehabilitation? Because that's more of a concept of the ecological side of things, perhaps, or the environmental. So no one sort of, and as I said, coming from the Swedish context, they have their Swedish terms for a few of these as well. So there's a little bit of ambiguity in what you actually use. I find these now, being in the industry, a little bit interchangeable: reclamation, rehabilitation, restoration. Quite often, a mining company's closure goals will be return the land to people and nature, create a post-mining land use. So it's a bit hard just to stamp one of these terms on what we do, I think. Remediation, I find a little bit different within the industry. I mean, that example from Julie Bargman, remediating the water, the project with the bioreactors, you're remediating the water. There's a toxin in the water, pollutant that you're removing. So I find that's quite easy to define within the industry and sort of use quite clearly. Sometimes often a soil scientist or a hydrologist that'll be dealing with a particular issue. So that sort of wraps itself up into the remit of all of these, but it's a clear definition within them. Regeneration, haven't used so much, to be honest, within the industry. Resilience, it gets used a little bit, more to do with the ecology side of things. And that's if you're reading an ecologist report. They might talk about re-establishing resilient plant communities. So that's how they, in my view, are sort of used a little bit within the industry. To give a further example of this, again, sorry for the text, there's a link here to this research paper. This is a research paper from a professor in the University of Madrid that we work with on a few of our projects, who teaches geomorphic design. It's got a little team at the university doing some great work in Spain. So he calls geomorphic reclamation also rehabilitation and restoration. So he's saying there they'll be interchangeable. But then interestingly, he says reclamation is mainly from the US or Canada, which makes a bit of sense looking at where my first introduction to the R's come from. Julie Bargman and Alan Berger, which they talk reclamation. US makes sense. Australia often use rehabilitation, which I've seen often in their sort of environmental reports as well. He goes on to say reclamation and rehabilitation, he thinks, are sort of imply incomplete activities to heal damaged landscapes, which I thought was quite interesting. But then he goes on to put a bit of context around what he uses, which is restoration. So geomorphic restoration, as he thinks restoration has the highest impact correction to ecosystems. So maximizes the recovery of the disrupted ecosystem. So I've read previous papers from Professor Jose Francisco, and he interchanges reclamation, rehabilitation, restoration within the same paper, all meaning the same thing. But here he's actually gone on one step further to define geomorphic restoration, putting a bit of context around why he thinks that is. And I think that was an interesting evolution in his thinking as well, and what they've been doing over in Spain. So I thought that was quite interesting from my perspective as well, as I've been sticking with reclamation. And I guess in my head, I put a bit of context around that. I think, oh, well, it's got a bit of the environmental side as well, and re-establishing ecosystems. And and all of this. But he's gone on to define that as restoration a little bit further. So if we then go into look at a project, because the long and short of it is I'm still not really sure after all of this where you can use some of these terms and why you should use them and what context you should use them in. So if we just looked at a bit of a project based on what might be wrapped up in a geomorphic project that we're working on. So a company's goals, whether they're legal or whether there's just a company pushing forward some of their agendas, you might want a post-mining landscape out of all of this. So something for the Sami to use, or a local ski group to use recreationally again. You want to blend with the surrounding landscape. You want to create a landform suitable for ecological recovery with a rich biodiversity. You look to minimise your environmental impacts. That might include a bit of remediation. You want to create a landscape that's safe for humans again. So there's some of the goals that you might be facing and looking to achieve and showing how you're going to achieve these. So then if we looked at the projects and the goals that overlay them, so we look at a landform design here, the geomorphic design. We think that this is the sort of fundamental to get all of these other things correct. So creating this sort of natural landform, as we've discussed with the waste rock. And then on top of that, you've got a cover material. It can be a semi-permeable material to stop water and oxygen trying to come into the waste rock to prevent some of this acid mine drainage. You've probably got a topsoil on there as well to help the vegetation establishment. Then you've got the correct vegetation for your target species to come back. So all of that is sort of wrapped up in your landform design and your sort of post-mine or your mine closure thinking. Then you also might have a bioreactor, these subsurface holes in the ground, which then remediate some of the water or clean some of the water from some of the leachate chemicals that's left on the waste rock still. So then if you looked at where the R's fit into this project, if you're going to try and use one specifically for the project, and this is using the definitions that I think you guys use, that Sara provided me, that
yeah, that's correct, Matt.
Introduced to you guys. Yep. So reclamation. So, I look at it again, that's social, some sort of suitable for some sort of human use. So I feel like, that's getting that stable landform is critical in having it be usable again for society afterwards. So then is reclamation linked with the sort of landform design, but then the cover materials and the sort of vegetation that you get on top of it is also important for being safe for humans to use again. So then you get sort of restoration, rehabilitation coming in over the top of this landform design, where you look at the environmental components. You're looking to determine what are your target species, what is the characterization of waste, so what can we actually plant that will be successful there. So they're dependent also on getting the reclamation, getting the landform correct. So, I keep coming back, are they just interchangeable words? That, a client, if I said, oh, we're doing geomorphic reclamation, restoration, rehabilitation, they're not going to question which, depending on maybe your country that you're in, but generally, for me, they sort of roll into each other a little bit because they are all dependent on each other. Remediation, again, I think that stands by itself quite easily and clearly. I mean, that's got a particular purpose, maybe within, the combined of these or each one of these. It's got a specific function within each of them. It's sort of a niched thing. And then there's resilience. I thought this one was quite interesting when I was thinking about it a little further, when I try to line up with the project that we're working on. I mean, resilience is the way I use it, the ability to bounce back, recover from disturbance, we've said here, withstand change. So we come in, we dig a big hole in the ground, we smash the landscape to pieces. We don't get to see how resilient that plant or that sort of landscape is. If we left it alone, we could see how quickly it bounced back and how quickly it recovers. But I was sort of thinking, well, we come in and we do all of this, so we don't give that opportunity for that landscape, thankfully, because we don't want to just leave it as the miners left it, to show its resilience. So we try and build resilience in the new species that we put in, and the soils and all of that stuff that we do. So resilience sort of sits out for a little bit to the side for me. I mean, well, I guess it forms part of, it's a term within this, isn't it? In these ones, rehabilitation, restoration, re-establishing some form of resilience where possible. Regeneration, with this definition, seeks to resolve urban problems. It does mention economic, physical, social, and environmental. So besides the urban, I mean, they're quite economic, physical, social, and environmental. I thought was quite nice to wrap everything up in this. So if you put landscape regeneration, it creates a different sense of the word than just sort of a more urban problem. So, I mean, where does that leave everything, really? I mean, how many R's is enough? If you're a soil scientist and you're working on the remediation of the soil, maybe one R is enough. But if you're a landscape architect working on geomorphic design, where you have a social agenda, you're working with that soil scientist to try and help form your landscapes to direct water to where he needs it. Perhaps there's not enough. You fit into a few more R's with what you do. So I don't know if anyone knows what a portmanteau is. This is where my thinking led to finish with it all, because I was a bit confused. I don't know if I was better off after this, doing all of this thinking, or worse off with my definitions of the R's. But anyway, a portmanteau, for those that don't know, I only discovered this recently, was a blend word. So the beginning of one word is combined with the final part of another. So brunch, for example, breakfast and lunch, is an example of this. So then perhaps where I'm heading with this is pulling out a few of the R's, the 6 R's we're talking about, a couple of new ones that come up through the process: revitalisation, recovery, renew. Perhaps it's time for a new R that we can hopefully define as a single R. We don't need 6 perhaps, that then encompasses a little bit more of what we do. Is where I managed to get to with all of this thinking and ramblings is I'm still a reclamation man, but in my head, I use reclamation with a little bit of restoration and rehabilitation in there. Same as Jose had done with his lecture. He's put context around that. The context I have is in my head. So I don't know where that leaves people and what people's thinking has been with your understanding of the definitions, but that's where I'll leave it today. So happy to debate and get any feedback on that.
Thank you, Matt. What a privilege it's been to hear from you today, and some amazing insights. And what a great challenge here. I think we might actually attend to the question that you've left here at the end in the seminar on Wednesday, and come back to you with some mashups that you might choose to adopt from.
That's one thing I didn't have time to do, but it'd be interesting
We'll
if we
give
could
it a
come up with
go.
something. Yeah.
Exactly. Look, I mean, I really want to give the students that have joined us today an opportunity to respond or ask questions. I guess just in summary, I love that. At core to the work that you do is really that social dimension, and I just think that's a really powerful driver and really important for us as landscape architects to be attuned to. That even in this world of mining, that arguably may not have that social agenda at its heart, that this opportunity to repair is driven by a very much a care for each other and for place and for landscape. So that's wonderful. I appreciated that you referenced Julie Bugman because we looked at her last week, but I had forgotten about Alan Burgess. So that's great, and I've added some of those texts into the learning management for the students. And I love the way that you move between scales, because as you've demonstrated, this terraforming or firming work that you do is quite extraordinary in the scale. So I think to really understand the work and the scale and the volume of soil, some of those metrics that you threw out today was just incredible. And then this really beautiful relationship between terra and ground and water, and the way that water landscapes reclaim these landscapes, maybe in a place that wouldn't have existed with that much water, but really allow, as you articulated, those ecological niches, aquatic niches, to, I guess, establish anew on some of these sites. So that was
Yeah.
kind of what the cloud, the brain cloud, I guess, that I was forming throughout your presentation. But Craig, Hannah, Joe, Jingji, or Yunyi, do any of you have questions? And if so, I invite you to put your microphone on and ask Matt before we conclude.
Thanks, Matt. That was brilliant. I just had a quick question. I know we had some lectures recently about some of the indigenous knowledge systems and that sort of thing, and I know you had sort of spoken to that in Sweden with the reindeer herders and that sort of thing. How do you kind of really blend that in with some of that kind of topography change? And I think that was one of the things that stood out to me with indigenous knowledge systems is not messing too much with some of that topography. I know mines are obviously messing massively with that, but yeah, how do you kind of factor that side of things into it?
Yeah, good question, buddy. We haven't done it so successfully here, to be honest. We've made the assumption that what we do is good for the reindeer herders and for the reindeers, because we disrupt their migration paths. So they move from the mountains down to the coast over the seasons. So we heavily disrupt them, but so does the road infrastructure and forestry. So they, anyway, getting off topic with that, I could go on about reindeers all day. So we haven't had the opportunity to discuss. There's a bit of resistance and not the best relationship with the reindeer herders and the mining industry here. So we've been pushing hard to get ourselves in with the Sami villages. There's numerous Sami villages across the different sites. To actually show them what we do and then get their feedback and say, look, we can create a steeper slope on the sort of western side if the prevailing winds are coming from the northeast or whatever, so we can provide a bit of shelter for your reindeers. What slopes do they like? Because we know at the moment they're not going to go up those traditional deposits that we saw. They're just too steep. They get to the bottom. There's a lot of sort of loose material, so that they don't reuse those traditional sites the way they build them today. So we assume ours are better for the reindeer, but we're yet to have that discussion with some of the herders how we can design them a little bit better or more practical for their reindeer, which is something, as I said, we've been pushing to do. It's a delicate situation because I understand they don't want their land taken. And to be honest, in my world, if the mine site didn't start because, they were prioritised the Sami industry, that would be fantastic. But I come at it a little bit from the fact that this has happened. I didn't make the decision. There's people with bigger paychecks than me that made that decision. And I just want to benefit and do the best we can given the circumstance. So long story short, we're working on it. We need to sit down with them and have a proper consultation and show them what we do. And this test site is brilliant. It's really going to open up a lot of, to go out and show them something that's not on paper and say, let's have a look. This is what it could be. What do you guys think? Can we do it differently? So that's going to be a big factor in moving forward with them, hopefully.
Great question, Joe, and thank you for your honest response there, Matt. I think the question that Australia is certainly facing is how we collaborate with First Nations people and allow them to self-determine is an international context, and I think being aware of that as landscape architects is wonderful, and if we can be attuned to it and drive change in that space as well, I think that's a great opportunity. Anyone else there? Any other questions before we let Matt get on with his beautiful sunny midsummer kind of weather?
Yeah, exactly. You know it. It's fantastic.
Well, if not, Matt, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Wonderful to connect with you and to hear from you again. It's been a long time. I know that the students will love that. We will come back to you with some of those Portamatatu mashup words. And from all of us here, Hadagot and Haydor, and we look forward to chatting again some other time.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for the opportunity. Hopefully, out of all that ramblings, you got a few nice discussion points to continue with. So pleasure, and good luck with your studies, gang.
Beautiful. Thanks, Matt. Have a top day.
Thanks, Matt.
Same to you.
See you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.